Listen for words of faith from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 60, verses 1 to 6. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of God has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But God will arise upon you, and glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and leaders to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Your daughters and your sons shall come from far away, escorted in safety. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camel caravans shall cover your roads, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of God. For joyful visions made known through the ages, we give thanks.
Listen for words of faith in the Gospel of Matthew. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, astrologers from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born under the ruler of the Jews?" For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And also, and you, Bethlehem in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the astrologers and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you've found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they'd heard the king, they set out, and there, ahead of them, went a star that had been seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. For the word that was in the beginning, for the word made known to Christ, in Christ, for the word embodied in us, we give thanks.
Well, before we dive into the passage that we'll be exploring today, I think it's appropriate that on the first Sunday I bring a confession before you. I have three things to confess because we tend to be Trinitarian in the Christian faith. Three things that really get up my nose. I like to ride my bike, and when I'm riding my bike down a pathway that's wide enough for two people to pass, sometimes I encounter someone wearing headphones who's completely oblivious to what's coming up behind them. I ding, I say, "Hello, hello," and they don't move. and on occasion I've had to get right up on their right-hand side, and they, as if they own the whole world, not caring about me one little bit. That's one gripe, and I feel better for sharing that with you. Here's the second one, and there is some similarity. Glenda and I live at Wentworth Point and frequently catch the train from Rhodes, and you have to walk up the steps and down the steps. And I've noticed that when I'm in a hurry, people get on their phone and they walk really slowly down the steps and you can't get past them. Now, I'm busybody enough to be a little inquisitive about what are they looking at. It must be very important, but it's not, in my view. Sometimes it's things like some sort of game or even cartoons. What are people thinking? I feel better that you've given me the freedom to confess that, although I guess you didn't have much chance. Now, here's the third one, and it does actually relate a bit more to the passage that we're dealing with today. One of the things that really gets up my nose is when you see a nativity scene and it has a stable and animals, and very European-looking animals actually, and Mary and Joseph. And then above the stable is a star, and there are wise men, always men, and there's always three of them with little boxes. And the trouble with that is that whoever created the nativity scene got the story from Matthew and the story from Luke and kind of mushed them up together. And I think it's a really slack thing to do. Now, when I was sharing my thinking about where this reflection would go this morning, I shared my thinking with someone with whom I share my life and whose wisdom I always seek and usually listen to. And I shared how this got up my nose, and this person said, well, what's it matter? Here's why I reckon it matters. To mush up the two stories, you sort of lose the particular perspective that the author of Luke and the author of Matthew had, and they're quite different. You might recall the excellent reflection that Jo Dowling-Starker brought to us on the 14th of last month, where she reflected upon how the good news in Luke was brought to those who are overlooked in society. And she pointed out that women were treated appallingly badly. She pointed out that the good news came to a couple for whom there was no room. And the revelation of the birth of Christ was brought not to people who are high in society, but to lowly shepherds, most of whom were ritually unclean because they were too busy looking after the sheep rather than attending to the things that they should do. Alison last week reminded us that the story in Matthew has many parallels with Moses, and the author of Matthew sort of portrays Moses as a kind of, Jesus I should say, as a kind of neo-Moses leading people from oppression to freedom. And in Matthew's story, the Christ child is found in a house, not a lowly stable. There's no indication in the Matthew story that the child was a neonate, because later on the story goes on that Herod says all children under the age of 2 should be slaughtered, so perhaps Jesus was as old as 2, and that might ring a bell with the story of Moses when Pharaoh said you've got to slaughter all the children. In the story of Matthew, it's not a group of angels that heralds the arrival of the Christ child, but rather the cosmos itself. A star stops over the place where the child is to be found to acknowledge Jesus. Now, this Jesus is better than Moses. Moses could part the seas, but Jesus ended up walking right across them. And to harmonise those stories of Jesus coming to the poor and lowly and Jesus as a kind of neo-Moses gives rather a bland view of Jesus that the scriptures give us. Now, if you're a student of the lectionary, you'll know that today is actually Christmas too. And we're not doing the readings for Christmas too. We're doing the readings for Tuesday, which is Epiphany. And it's always on the 6th of January. That's a season in the church which reflects upon the manifestation of Christ to all people. And Epiphany goes from the 6th of June to Shrove Tuesday, just before Lent begins. And of course, that season varies in length because Easter changes around. So on Tuesday, the Universal Church will be celebrating the arrival of the Magi, but we're getting in a bit earlier. This morning I'd like to suggest that there are two foci in this story, and the first one is that the author of Matthew spends a huge amount of time identifying that this Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one, the one hoped for. An understanding of the geopolitical situation of the time is helpful. And I'm indebted to the thoughts of C.J. Cornthwaite for some of these thoughts. If you've got a spare moment, you might go to YouTube and look him up. He's a person who grew up in a conservative religious environment, actually rejected Christianity, he wouldn't call himself Christian, but he's a student of Christian history and very interesting to listen to. Anyhow, the Magi were not kings, so that hymn, "We Three Kings of Orientar," for years I couldn't figure out what Orientar was, but there's no indication in the text that these were three kings. There's also no indication that there were three of them. That tradition has emerged because there were three gifts. But they were probably Zoroastrian priests. Now, Zoroastrianism was an ancient religion, and it was the religion of the Persian Empire. It shared much with Judaism, and that had a lot of contact with Judaism. King Cyrus of Persia, many centuries before, or 5 centuries before, was from a Zoroastrian area, and he supported the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem following a decree that the Babylonian exile was over. That exile went from 587 to 537 before the Common Era. Some of the beliefs of Zoroastrianism was confidence in the symbolism of light and dark, a belief in an apocalypse. They had a messianic hope. They believed that the future could be foretold in dreams, and probably most significantly, they believed that Rome would eventually fall. Now, these people they looked for signs. They were astrologers, and they observed this star. Geographically, they were from the east of Judea in the Parthian territory. Rome was to the west. Poor little Judea was in the middle, sandwiched between these two nations between which there was tension. So it's understandable that Herod was fairly nervous when these Eastern astrologers come and say, look, there's a new king rising and he's in Judea. Matthew, or the author of Matthew, also stresses the story of Jesus by the gifts that are brought. Gold, fit for a king or for royalty, frankincense, and incense that was used in the temple, and myrrh for embalming. And those gifts had a history in the Jewish tradition. So to reiterate, the first point is Matthew took a lot, or the author of Matthew went to great lengths to say this child Jesus is the one hoped for, is the Messiah. Now, the second focus is a story about people who crossed boundaries. The astrologers who came were not of the same religion of Jesus. They were Zoroastrians. But they recognised that someone from a different religion was actually going to be the fulfilment of messianic hope that he had held. In other words, hope comes from somewhere, from a different region and a different religion. Now that kind of sets a bit of a germ of the idea of the expansive nature of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. It opens with these visitors from another place coming and visiting Jesus. Now, if you know Matthew well, you'll recall that in the 15th chapter, there's this great story where Jesus meets a woman, a Syrophoenician woman, who says, "Come and I need your help." And Jesus said, "I don't come I'm here for the lost sheep of Israel. I don't give anything to the dogs." And the woman says, "Well, shouldn't the dogs be fit to gather at the crumbs?" And Jesus is actually changed by the encounter. Oh, which, as an aside, demonstrates Jesus doesn't come as a complete parcel, but rather he evolves. So it starts with this Zoroastrian visit. Then in the middle, it's for the lost sheep of Israel. But it ends with the Great Commission. Go into all the lands and teach them to obey everything that I have told you. So there's a kind of universality in the Jesus that the author of Matthew describes. He is the one that leads from oppression to fullness of life. Now, sadly, and I guess somewhat inevitably, this idea that Jesus gets people are required to follow what Jesus has taught is used as a weapon, and some people have argued, well, unless you believe in Jesus, you're not acceptable, because Jesus is the only way to life. And unless you think what I think, you're wrong. I used to think that until I was about 18. Then after that, I realised, maybe there's more to life than what I think. The trick is that usually people equate being Christian or following the ways of Jesus exclusively with adopting the system of Christianity. And the system of Christianity, in which we gather here today, took 2,000 years to evolve. And indeed, one could follow the system of Christianity, but not actually follow the way of Jesus. And I'd like to suggest that to follow the way of Jesus is to live lovingly towards all people and towards our environment. I started off with a confession, and those three gripes did have something in common. The headphone-consumed person blocking my bike ride, or the person looking at the phone down the steps, and indeed the harmonisation of the Gospels, all have a common thread that people failed to look up at the signs. So the questions that we should ask about every passage that we come to as we come to worship is, what can we learn about this particular passage, the visit of the Magi? And I'd like to suggest that we need to be open to the possibility of crossing our boundaries of our own traditions and indeed for our own prejudices. And we should look up for the signs of Christ at work, and they might be very small. Last week when Glenda and I were leaving the church, John and Robin said, "Oh, look, there's a taxi driver out there. He's got a broom in his car and he sweeps up all the cigarette butts out the front of the church." Now, he doesn't need to do that, but I would suggest to you that person has the Spirit of Christ who wants to spiffy up the place and recognises that someone's got to do this rather unpleasant job. That's only a small example. A much bigger one is to recognise the way that the faith communities in this country have drawn together and expressed their absolute abhorrence about what happened at Bondi some weeks ago. People from all the Christian denominations and various faiths have said we must unite and stand against what a few people are trying to do in this country. So let's look up and see God at work. Now, to aid that task, I'd like to suggest a way of observing God, not so much as a noun, but as a verb. And I would suggest that that verb is connecting. And certainly, there's great need in our world for connecting as we seem to be becoming increasingly polarised. So, this Epiphany, let us celebrate the manifestation of the divine in our tradition, and let us look for signs of the divine at work in our world. The Lord be with you.